Today, we're going to go digging in the past to find out what modern pop producers can learn from Jimi Hendrix's Have You Ever Been to Electric Ladyland from his album Electric Ladyland. So let's just dive in. The first thing that you'll notice is the unusual phrasing.
Have you ever been? Have you ever been to Electric Ladyland?
So when you look up sheet music for this, you'll probably find it written all in 4/4, but really the chords don't always line up with that. I would put this in kind of like a 2 bars of 3, a bar of 2, another bar of 3, and then a 5, and then the whole thing kind of restarts again. Whether or not that's necessary, I don't know, and whether or not that's how they're thinking about it, I don't know. But the point is, the phrasing is kind of weird, okay? How would you make this work if you wanted to write a song this way? We can kind of look, for the most part, to the drums for the answer. He's kind of always hitting the snare on the quarter notes most of the time.
Have you ever been? Have you ever been to Electric Ladyland?
He's not actually hitting the snare all the time on the quarter notes, but when he's not, it's usually because the whole band is just doing the same punches. He's setting up the next hit and everyone's playing the same thing, so you don't really need to have the snare going all the time. It's really in those long gaps when you hear those kind of guitar solo things happening, and then he's kind of just like laying down the snare on the quarter notes, because the bass, as you've noticed, is a lot busier than we typically expect, especially these days.
Have you ever been? Have you ever been to Electric Ladyland? The magic carpet waits.
This is where we kind of can talk about the concept of trade-offs in music. If you're thinking in terms of modern production styles, normally the bass is attached to a bunch of other things to make a lot of sound feel like it's coming from one thing. So like the bass tied to the kick, tied to synths or guitars or whatever, to make this one giant thing. So you can't write music in this way with that kind of sound, because big sounds are not meant to travel fast, and it would just sound really stupid. Whereas this one, it's a more kind of pared down, simple sound, not super broad in terms of its frequency range, and it's not super loud. It's more nimble and agile, and because of that, it's allowed to kind of outline the chords a bit more, do more interesting rhythms. You're either going to make your song as this one huge thing that's coming at you, or a bunch of little things that people can kind of shift their attention to, and each one plays this little part in a big thing. So at the end of the day, both can sound big, but they're just going to have like a different quality. They're just not going to hit you the same way, but they can still sound big. So now if we skip to the chorus, things kind of start to line up more.
I'll show you different emotions. I wanna show you the sounds and emotions.
In the verses, the drums are more freeform, and they're kind of just like doing hits, noodling a bit in between, or just doing like the quarter notes. But in the chorus, it's more of a driving groove. The phrasing is more conventional. The meter is more obvious. The production is kind of pared down, slightly simplified, but still floaty and weird like the verses were. So it's kind of contrasting and not contrasting at the same time. And I find that really interesting.
Electric woman waits for you and me. So it's time we take a ride. You can cast all your hang-ups over the sunshine while we fly right over the love-filled sea. Look up ahead, I see the love land. Soon you will understand.
So this part is interesting because normally when you get to the end of the section, the band is kind of telegraphing that we're getting to the end, and they're sort of building up into the next section where the payoff would be on bar 1 of the next section. But instead here, the drums actually drop out for a while. But the previous times when the drums drop out, that's when the guitar and bass are joining together to play the same thing. But then in this part, when we're coming to the end of the section, the bass is kind of playing its line and the drums drop out. And that's something that we've never heard before. And at this point, we don't really know what's happening because we're expecting a buildup into the next section like they did in other parts of the song, but instead the drums drop out. And also, if you listen to the drums before they drop out, you realize that they start to build up, so you think that that's going to continue until the end of the next section.
Up ahead, I see the love land. Soon you will understand.
And then on top of that, we're kind of faked out into thinking that we're listening to it in a new key, but actually they only just changed the first chord of the section. We think we're in a new key, but then, oh no, we're actually just in a different part of the same key, because after a few chords, we realize that it's the same thing, but it sounds fresh because we started on a different note, different chord kind of thing. The drums are playing a lot more with like direction than before and louder than before too. So it really adds a lot of excitement to this part. Another thing to mention about the chorus is that the chords are still moving, but then the bass note is kind of just sitting on that A flat the whole time. Even though things are still moving, it's a lot easier to orient yourself because you only have to make sense of how the top is moving in relation to a constant, which is the bass note. Whereas before, you're kind of always reassessing where you are because the rhythm is different, the chord and bass note is changing all the time. So it's a nice contrast between the two sections. So to do a quick recap of what we talked about, phrasing in the verses is really unusual because you have this kind of compression and then expansion of time. It feels like it's kind of just rubato because you have like each chord gets a different amount of time at a same pulse. It's this weird dichotomy of being free, but also still regimented. Another interesting point about this whole song is that the bass is really kind of driving the tune, you know, because the drums, they're either just doing the hits and doing little setups in between the hits, or they're kind of just doing a constant quarter note, which is necessary given that compression and expansion thing that I just talked about. So the bass really has a lot bigger of a role to play in driving the song. It's very melodic, it's very soloistic. The rhythms are varied a lot. You're drawn to that and it's kind of leading you into the next chords, you know, which is a really cool texture to have. Another interesting point is that the choruses kind of contrast the verses while being similar at the same time. In the verses, the chords and the bass notes are changing a lot. In the chorus, the chords still change a lot, but the bass is just sitting on that one note. And then the last thing that I want to kind of reiterate is that little drop before the section ends and we get to the top of the form again. The drummer and like the band in general starts building up a few bars before the end, but then the drummer drops out, and then when it comes back, we just changed the first chord of the new section. So it's kind of a fake out modulation, and the drums come back on the one and it's kind of this huge like explosion, but it's very different than what we heard before. So we think that we're in new territory when really we're not. And the setup kind of really makes that work by faking out like, oh, we're not building up, and now we're in a new key all of a sudden, but not really. All right, so that wraps it up for this little breakdown video. I hope you liked it. If you did, please like and subscribe for more cool dissections and explorations in the other side of pop. And if anything, I hope this video kind of encourages you to go digging in the past to look for inspiration for your own music. I love doing that, so I'll be doing that more on this channel too. All right, thanks for watching. Peace.